Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Grand Challenges of Our Time Presidential Distinguished Forum. I'm Natifia Mullins, the Director of Communications at the University of Maryland, and today's moderator. This is the third forum in a series of discussions featuring renowned experts who are at the forefront of today's most pressing issues, from the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change to voter access and the social unrest that has led to the Black Lives Matter movement. Current national and world events present unprecedented challenges, but they also provide a meaningful chance to investigate today's issues together and explore new and better paths forward. Today's speaker is UMD alum Reginald Dwayne Betts, a critically acclaimed writer, widely requested public speaker, and an advocate for criminal justice reform. President Pines will introduce him shortly, which will be followed by a presentation and a Q&A session. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to go through. We are recording today's discussion and providing live captioning. If you'd like to turn on captioning, click on the caption icon at the bottom of your screen. We're also taking questions via the Q&A feature. You can submit a question at any time during the discussion. And now, President Pines.
Good afternoon, Maryland community, and welcome. We are so excited to have Mr. Reginald Dwayne Betts here today. Duane was born and raised in Suitland, Maryland. His remarkable path took him from prison to poetry, spending 9 years in prison for his role in a carjacking at age 16. During his incarceration, he discovered a passion for poetry and literature. And after his release, he pursued a Bachelor's of Arts, a Master's of Fine Arts, and a J.D., and is now in a Ph.D. program and a law candidate at Yale Law School. As a Liman Fellow, he spent a year representing clients in the New Haven Public Defender's Office. His most recent book, Felons, Poems, received the 2019 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Poetry. In 2012, President Obama appointed him to an advisory group on youth incarceration. Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut also appointed him to the Criminal Justice Commission, the state body responsible for hiring prosecutors in the state of Connecticut. In 2018, Duane was named Guggenheim and NEA Fellow. His poetry has been long praised, and his writing has generated national attention and earned him a Soros Justice Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Ruth Lilly Fellowship, an NAACP Image Award, and a New American Fellowship. Duane has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post, as well as being interviewed on NPR's Fresh Air, the Tavis Smiley Show, and several other national outlets. As a University of Maryland alum, an incredible advocate for social justice, I personally wanted to invite Duane to join us for this series of Grand Challenge forums. Duane's story is powerful, it's emotional, it's heavy, and though personal, the tough experiences he lived through are not unusual for men of color. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Reginald Dwayne Betts.
Yeah, thank you, President Pines. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I think I'll speak for a few minutes, and I think I'll tell some stories that I haven't told in quite a long time and try to frame why this moment and returning to Maryland in this way is quite important to me. I came home from prison on March 4th, 2005. And I was 24. By April, I was on the campus of Maryland University trying to enroll. And I remember going to I was able to figure out email, relatively quickly, right? And so I knew how to look up the university, find an advisor, send the email. And I suspect that the person got this email in April from a prospective student looking to enroll immediately. And I'm sure they got that email and wondered, what is this story? The semester ends in a little over a month. He's talking about enrolling right now. He seems to have no sense of what it means to be a student, but I'll take the meeting. And I had a car but I didn't know directions that well. And this is pre-GPS. So I'm certain I was 20 minutes late. I found Maryland basically because of that huge M. It's 17 parking lots on the university. So it took me another 25 minutes to find out how to get to the counselor's office. And I got to this advisor's office and I sit down and we start talking. And I faced this dilemma that I would face time and time again when I first came home from prison. He would ask me questions that I couldn't answer honestly unless I admitted that I had been to prison. And so he was telling me as respectfully as he could that the class of 2009 had already been like chosen. And I couldn't understand why he was talking about 2009 when it was 2005. And so I kept telling him, that's fine. I don't want to be in the class of 2009. I want to start school right now because I got locked up when I was so young that I graduated from high school in a prison cell. And I wasn't a part of a class of 1998. And the memory of the class of 1998 was so distant that I just didn't understand it. And so I finally tell this man that I just came home from prison about 30 days ago. And he looked at me and said, well, the good news is, how old are you? And I said, I'm 24. He said, the good news is you don't have to take the SAT. And I was like, that's the good news? He was like, the bad news is that we've already selected the class. You know, the semester's already almost over. I gotta tell you, I didn't know what the word semester meant. And so when he said the semester's almost over, I just kept it in the back of my head to look up semester when I left his office. And he gave me some of the best advice in my life, though. He told me, go to community college, spend a semester in community college, and then transfer to the University of Maryland. And he said, if you're as smart as you say you are, you'll be able to get into the University of Maryland. And so that's what I did. I went to community college and went to Prince George's Community College. My first day at community college, they make you take an exam. And I had promised myself that I wouldn't tell anybody that I went to prison. But I'd already told this advisor at University of Maryland because I had no choice. And I said, well, I won't tell anybody else. And it's fine that I told him because I'm not going to attend the University of Maryland, at least right now. So it's okay. I go to PG Community College and I take this test and I test in the honors English and I test in the algebra. But to take honors English, you have to go and get it approved by one of the professors. So I go get it approved and she asked me how old I am. I'm like 24. She's like, I just don't understand why did it take you so long to go to college? And I have no answer. And I'm kind of frustrated with the question because I don't feel like lying. And I tell her, I just got out of prison. And she says, for somebody so smart, you must have did something that was really stupid. I was like, yeah, I carjacked somebody. And this woman, Dr. Melinda Frederick, became my advisor and became instrumental in me becoming a student at the University of Maryland. But I want to say that I started school there and everything was going great. And this is the part where it gets complicated because I learned that if you stayed at Maryland for 2 years, you were guaranteed admission into a bunch of schools and guaranteed a full tuition scholarship to Howard University. And so I would return to this professor's office and tell her that I was going to get into the Honors Academy. And she would tell me every time I came to her office, that sounds great, but you haven't had a grade in your life in the last 9 years, you know? And she was like, you talk an excellent game, but let's see. And I ended up getting into the Honors Academy, ended up doing really well at community college. And I took the full tuition academic scholarship to the Howard University. And I remember it like it was yesterday. Must have been 2007. I had started a book club at Caribou Books. Life is really random. I met a woman there who was a friend of mine who became a friend. And another woman came into the bookstore and said, I'm looking for this book. I got her the book. I tried to sell a book for her son who was with her. And she said, I'm okay. And I said, I give you 10% off. And she said, I'm okay. I said, I give you 20% off. And she said, I'm okay. And if you offer me any more money off, I'm not going to get this book. So I was like, that's messed up. So I sell her the book she wanted and she left. And I call my friend and I tell her what happened. And I tell her, this is what's wrong with Black people. I did 8.5 years in prison and I'm assessing the phase of the Black community as if I know anything, right? And my friend had 2 sons, and she said, how much do diapers cost? Why would I know how much diapers cost? She said, how much is Similac? I don't know. How much is how much is on childcare? Have no idea. And anyway, and then she asked me, anyway, what are you doing to make more Black boys read? So she says this, and I start a book club. And this is all happening around the same time, and it'll come together in a second. So I start a book club called Young Men Read. And then they come and they want to do a story about the book club, and they do the story and ends up on the front page of the Washington Post. And so we talking about 2007. It was on the front page of the Post. And I end up getting a book deal because of this. So 2007 is going lovely. I got a book deal to write a memoir. I got a full tuition scholarship to Howard University. And now all I need to do is go and sign this paper. I go to Howard and I arrive on campus, park on Georgia Avenue, right across the street from what used to be Soul Veg. And walk in, go into, I think it's the Mordecai building. We go to the top floor, to the 3rd floor, whatever. And it's all of my classmates. And this is sort of like a celebration because we the ones who chose Howard. And some of us knew each other from when we started community college. And I look at the paper and it has this question: have you ever been convicted of a felony? So now I know I have to say yes. And it's not really catching me off guard because I had wrote an essay in my application arguing that I owed to Howard University, because it represented the Black community, I owe more for my crimes to them and to like PG County than I did to who people might suspect I needed to pay amends to. So I had wrote a whole essay about this, and I think that they know because I assume that they read my application. But something tells me that me and Dr. Frederick, this first woman in an academic institution at PG Community College that I told that I had a record, I pull her to the side and I say, I think this is an issue. And she's like, this is not an issue. We go into a room and the Howard person that we're talking to tells me, I don't think this would be a problem at all. And she recounts 3 incidences where people with criminal records did not get admitted to Howard. So I couldn't understand why it wasn't going to be a problem for me, since it was clearly a problem for all of these folks. And I get nervous, right? So I take my pen out because, mind you, I ain't been to law school yet, but I think a contract has some value. So I take my pen out, right? And on the slide, I go to sign the contract, and like she slips it from out under my hand. And this is when I get nervous. And she says, we'll get back to you. And they never got back to me. And after like a week or so, Dr. Frederick called me into her office and says, I was down, man. I had this book deal. We was about to have a baby, me and my wife. And I don't know, you kind of feel like you go to prison and you do your time and it's supposed to end at some point. And I crushed community college. I graduated with like 39 A's and 1 C. So I just couldn't understand the rejection, right? And I remember the summer well because I applied for the TAs and I was like arrogant and angry. And so when I applied, I ended up getting the interview, and I came in for the interview and I just was like, I swore that the university was hitting me with the flim flam. Now I understood that Justice Thurgood Marshall had got rejected from Maryland like a half a century before. And I'm not comparing myself to him in any kind of way, but I'm just saying I knew that he had gotten rejected from Maryland a half a century before because he was Black and had to go to Howard. And so I was like, when Howard rejected me because I was a felon, you got to be a fool if you think that Maryland is going to admit you. And I only stepped out there, one, because I was desperate. I had lied to my mama, told my mama that it was going to be okay. I was like, I'm certain that the university has I don't know, and I was just like, I don't know. I think it's going to work though. So I go to the meeting and it's 12 people around the table, and they ask me all of these questions, right? And they seduced me, honestly, because it got to the point that I was having such a good time answering the questions that I forgot that nobody said the word prison. And so at the end, they said, well, do you have any questions for us? Now, I had been out long enough and had been in enough interviews and had been in enough spaces and was savvy enough in prison to sort of just know that if the time flies by, everybody was having a good time. But I was like, this might be too much of a good time. So when they asked me if I had any questions, I said, well, it's interesting because I did 8.5 years in prison, and I know each of you know. And I'm wondering why nobody has asked me about my time in prison. And one of the interviewers said, well, we discussed this with the people who have the power to make that decision, and it's been decided that your admission will not be predicated on the crimes that you committed in your past. And so I ended up getting a full tuition scholarship and going to Maryland. And what's interesting, and I'll just tell one more story about Maryland, then I'll open it up for questions. But to me, what's interesting is like I wasn't a typical student at Maryland. I mean, I used to bring my kid to class with me when he was so young that he was still in the kind of stroller that you just unlock. You just unlock the little carrier and go to class. He would sit down in class with me and just chill. And I wrote a book while I was there. I was like the only undergraduate student that was in a graduate writing program. I mean, the school opened all of the doors for me and allowed me to succeed. But then, because I gotta push it, I gotta test the limits. So I'm on the verge of graduating, and I see some advertisement in the hallway that says, "Apply to be commencement speaker." And I say to myself, well, why not? My GPA is still above 3.5. Let me just go ahead and apply to be the commencement speaker and see what happens. And I applied, and the committee chose me. And I remember when I gave my speech, it was as a person that speaks publicly a lot now. And I mean, I've been fortunate to speak at a lot of universities and a lot of places, and both read my poetry and give talks and give formal lectures. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity. But it all started at Maryland. I would go to the dean's office and I would start to speak, and she would say, "Stop, slow down, slow down, slow down." And I nearly memorized my speech from so much practice. And I'll never forget standing on the stage. My family was there. And I said, nearly 12 years ago to this date, the Honorable Judge Box sentenced me to 9 years in prison. The row of parents was stunned, and they broke all norms and a graduation and start talking to each other. Did that young man just say that he was in prison for 9 years? And it was funny to me. But the thing that was beautiful is that even when I wrote my speech, it's like the university decided, first we will admit you on your academic merit, despite the fact that you have felonies. We will admit you based on your academic merit. And then when it came time for me to speak to it was like 4,000 graduates. It was like 10,000 or so people in the place. Beside me was man, I can't remember his name right now, but it was like the head of the CIA. Uh, when it was time for me to get a speech, nobody said, "Duane, we want you to get a speech, but please don't mention prison. Don't embarrass us." So it's a pleasure for me to come back today and talk to students and just be in a space because, I feel truly like an alum, but I feel truly like the University of Maryland was an institution that helped me become the kind of writer I am. And it was the institution really that first reminded me that there is a space um, to come back to the world and not had a cloud of a criminal conviction ruin your opportunities. And I feel like if more institutions took that lead, then we would have a more just society. So I thank you guys for listening to that bit of my story, but also I just thank you, President Pines, for having me.
Thank you, Duane, for sharing that incredible personal journey. And you just the journey that you just told makes me feel proud that our university when you were applying, focused on what you were trying to do and not where you started, but where you wanted to head and what your journey was. So I'm very proud of our university, and just a testament to you, testament to the people who put their faith in you. And I'm glad that you're back here returning the favor to share your experiences with our students. So I want to start off the questioning because people also should know that you are a poet and written several books. And so the first question I have for you is, what are you motivating people to do through your artwork, through your work as an artist, as a poet?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, partly because I think I wear a lot of different hats, and before I answer the question, I should say that when I went to Maryland, I had no intention on going to law school. And when I went to Maryland, I had no intention on writing for the New York Times. I had no intention. I wrote the recent piece about Kamala Harris, but it never crossed my mind that I would be able to write for a publication like the Times. And so I think one thing is important to admit is that as an artist, it's kind of fickle to go into the work thinking about what you want the work to make people do. I mean, I think I want the work to make people think primarily. I think I want the work to complicate folks' emotions around the issues that I write about, whether it's prison, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual assault and the assault of women, right? Whether it's about fatherhood. I want all of that work to make people think. But at bottom, I think I write to make myself understand the world better. And in doing it, I hope that if I'm lucky, it'll make folks understand the world better more than do something. When I think about what I do to make people do things, it's like that's when I'm straight an advocate. That's when I'm preparing parole packets. I've gotten 3 people out of prison. I've gotten 4 people out of prison in the past year. And when I'm doing network, and I'm talking about people, I got my old cell partner out of prison who had been locked up for 24 years. I got one of the guys who was next to me when I came into the penitentiary, who did 22, 23 years for a crime he didn't commit. I helped him get a conditional pardon. And network was purely, what do I want to happen? I want a parole board to say yes and release somebody. But that kind of work is very different from the artistic work. And I will say that I try to approach it all with the same honesty. But sometimes you can't help when you're being an advocate to hold things back. You can't help but to try to represent your client and your cause at the best of your ability. When I'm an artist, my cause is that it's just the truth, and it's a little bit more freeing to do that.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I'm wondering if I could go a little bit off script here, and if you'd be willing to do this, since I asked you the question about your artistic talent. I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to read a poem of yours to our audience, and then
Oh yeah,
we can go to other questions.
yeah. I'll read one. I'll read. You know what? I was gonna read this one called Blood History, but I want to read one about when my son learned that I'd been to prison because I don't know. I like that poem, and me and my son were playing basketball today, so I'm gonna read that one. So it's called Essay on Reentry, and it's about when he was 5 at the time, but it's essentially about when he learned that I've been incarcerated. Essay on Reentry. At 2 a.m., without enough spirit spilling into my liver to know to keep my mouth shut. My youngest learned of years I spent inside a box, a spell, a kind of incantation I was under. Not whiskey, but history. I robbed a man. This months before he would drop bucket after bucket on opposing players. The entire bedraggled bunch 5 and 6, and he leaping as if every layup erases something. That's how I saw it. My screaming, coaching, sweating, presence, recompense for the pen. My father has never seen me play ball as part of this. My oldest knew, told of my crimes by a stranger. Tell me we aren't running towards failure is what I want to ask my sons. but it is 2 in the a.m. The oldest has gone off to dream in the comfort of his room. The youngest, despite him seeming more lucid than me, just reflects cartoons back from his eyes. So when he tells me, Daddy, it's okay, I know what's happening is some straggling angel lost from his pack, finding a way to fulfill his duty, lending words to this kid who crawls into my arms, wanting more than stories of my prison, the sleep that he fought while I held court at a bar with men who knew that when the drinking was done, the drinking would make the stories we brought home any easier to tell.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm now going to turn it over to Natifia. She's going to entertain some questions with you.
Thank you for sharing that poem.
You're a
Feeling it
little
was
low.
really great and moving.
You're a little low, Natifia.
Yep, can you hear me better now? So yeah, we do have a question from Candace Benanyu in the chat, and she really just wanted to understand how you would define justice. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really complicated question. When you think about in my own space, if you asking for release of somebody from prison who killed somebody, it's very easy to take a position as purely an advocate, imagine that justice just means freedom. But I know folks who family members got murdered. I got family members who got murdered, and justice is quite complicated, and it's more complicated than like a shorthand answer. So what I believe justice is that moment when a community, when a group of citizens, when a state, when a nation decides that they will grapple with their most intense and deeply troubling problems and accept that the solution is going to be imperfect. You know, we live in a world where slogans rule, and it's cool until you the one that has to make a decision, or until you the one that's been hurt. And I believe justice is recognizing that we can and we should be tackling very difficult problems and recognizing that everybody won't be satisfied.
Right. And hard, of course, to explain, but you are involved in advocacy work around, social justice, criminal justice reform. So I wanted to know, what do you think, not being able to fully kind of talk through what justice is, what are some of the alternatives to what we see is problematic with the justice system? So mass incarceration, youth justice, what are your takes on that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you imagine as problematic. So I feel like my take on a few things is one, prisons are disastrously unsafe places. So I think the first thing is justice means finding a way to make our places of confinement far less dangerous and far less frightening. I think justice is imagining that you could let go. And right now in Connecticut, there's 11,000 people locked up. 4,000 of those people have less than 24 months. And of those 4,000, 2,000 have less than 12 months. We're in a global pandemic. Why are they still locked up? Now, some of those folks, they have less than 12 months, but they've been locked up for 20 years. And so the reason why they're locked up is because government officials don't want it to fall on them if they let somebody go and they do something violent or dangerous. And they feel like, well, I had no choice to let them go when they finish their sentence. But that ain't justice, because we are in the middle of a global pandemic. So that's one issue that I would say concretely we need to take like real and courageous and brave action on. And then I think it's a gambit though. You know, you mentioned youth justice. I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job of dramatically reducing the number of young people that's locked up across the country. I've spent a lot of time, and I'll give you one concrete, perfect example. I got locked up in 1996, and Virginia in like 1994, 1995, they ended parole for everybody. Every year I was locked up, we wanted parole to come back, and we waited for that bill to be passed. The bill was passed this past August to bring back parole for people who got locked up as a juvenile if they served 20 years. Now, part of the absurdity of that, and I'm grateful for it. I got at least one friend out of prison because of that. So I'm grateful for it. But part of the absurdity of that is that means that if I was locked up right now and that bill would have got passed, like if that bill would have got passed in 1996, I had a 9-year sentence, I would have never been eligible for parole because I would have never served 20 years in prison. So it is an absurdity in that like it's 20 years attached to that. And so justice looks like not just doing halfway measures towards the right thing, but doing what's actually the right thing. But even in that situation, it's complicated because you know why they passed it in August? After a quarter century, the Democrats had control of the state legislature for the first time. So I think it's complicated, and I think it's so many issues that we could run down the line that I have some familiarity about, but it's just no shorthand for you. I hire prosecutors. I hire people whose job is to lock people up. What does justice look like in that space? Well, for me, it means that like I have to be at the table asking some of the questions that need to be asked to figure out what is going on with this system. You know, I have a ring alarm, and the only function of the ring alarm, literally, the only function is to make us believe that we are overrun with crime. Some of it is cool because I cut on my ring alarm in the morning and I see all of these older white dudes with hats on and beards taking people's Amazon packages, and I want to send it to Fox News and be like, "See, it's more than black people committing crimes." You're supposed to laugh at that. but you know, but the truth is because look, it's more white people locked up than black people. But we have framed incarceration as only a black issue. So we have no convergence around parties that all want the same thing that's discussing it. And so I think, you know, it's just like really complicated to try to, it's really complicated to try to expansively answer that question, recognizing that like the answer shifts based on how you get positioned in the world. I mean, justice to me is like somebody from Howard University calling me saying, you know what, it's unfortunate that that happened to you and we were wrong. And I don't know how we make this right, but we were wrong. But the reality is that that is never going to happen. Never. You know, I got honorary degrees from universities, and I can't get Howard to admit that that's what happened to me. And if they won't admit that that's what happened to me, what hope do we have of really getting some fundamental change around how people get treated post incarceration? So I'm gonna stop talking bad about Howard. My wife went to Howard, just so y'all know.
Uh,
Do you have a question?
Sure, sure. So just following along that line of thinking on justice, at the University of Maryland, there's been a bunch of students for maybe more than a decade who have had a problem with the state's law, which requires University System of Maryland schools like ours to purchase furniture from those prisoners in the Maryland Correctional Enterprise that make the furniture and allow us to purchase it. But it's a state law that forces us to purchase it. And students believe that there should be a divestiture from the Maryland Correctional Enterprises because of the low wages that inmates receive doing this work. What would you say to our students about this situation? And maybe you can share with them a story of how you feel about skill sets that prisoners get while they're incarcerated.
Yes, I have a couple responses. I mean, one, I understand when people say people in prison don't make enough money. Um, you know, my first job in life was in a prison. I got paid 23 cents an hour. And I loved that job. I got fired though. I shouldn't admit that, but I got fired. Second job was the one I really loved. I was a pod librarian. That was like my fifth job. But um, my pay raise went up. I was like 38 cents an hour. The most I ever made in prison was 45 cents an hour when I was a law clerk. I once got somebody to prison though. You know, I filed a habeas corpus petition. They had 2 5-year sentences that were supposed to be run concurrent, but they were running it consecutive, and nobody in the state would listen to what this man was saying. And so he asked me to file a habeas corpus petition for him, and I did. Uh, he won. I charged him 3 soups, a box of Ritz crackers, and 2 cans of tuna fish to do this. And so, by the logic that we're advancing, I guess I should have charged him more. I should have charged him maybe $1,500 to do it. But obviously, he couldn't pay $1,500, and the rate of pay was measured by how much money we earned and how much money we had to spend. I think that people in prison want to work, they want to gain skills, and I always recognized that I wasn't paying rent. You know, and sometimes I think that one, if you force like AC Delco, they had jobs in Virginia, And if you worked in a shoe shop, you was making like $2-3 an hour. If you worked at AC Delco, you was making more than that, like maybe up to $7 an hour. If AC Delco had to pay $15 an hour, they would just pay $15 an hour to people in the world. The jobs would disappear. So it's not as if the jobs would remain. And if you argue that you want minimum wage to cripple the system, then that's a different kind of argument. I just think that people value work in prison, and the amount of money that I had to spend on things didn't necessitate minimum wage. I mean, we could say more. I would have loved to make more, but like $10 an hour just kind of seems like a quick way to force the state to start garnishing your wages, for rent, for food, right? But the other point about it, I think, is the quick story is that, this is the first thing I got that called me an attorney. And a man in prison made it. And I didn't know he made it when I got it. When I got it, the commissioner of the Connecticut DOC gave it to me. And when I got it, I was just happy to have gotten it. And that was a Friday when it was given to me. And it was something touching about somebody that represented DOC being the first person to acknowledge that I was an attorney. And I went into prison the following Monday, and I told him that story. And it was somebody in the room that was like, "Oh, damn, that was for you? I processed that order. My man made that." Because he worked in a print shop, and in the print shop that do all the kind of stuff like this at this particular prison, Connecticut had a contract with them as well. And I'm just saying that he valued his work, and that he would want the students. I think that they will want the students that expend energy arguing for divestiture to argue for freedom. I think that you'll find a lot of universities across this country where people argue for things like that, but they wouldn't want me in the classroom as a student. When I applied to law school, it was a few law schools that was like, tell me how your classmates would think about your knowledge of criminal law. I don't know nothing about criminal law. Do you mean you want me to tell you how my classmates would think about the fact that I put a pistol to somebody's head? You should just ask me that. And I live in a world where most of my peers have, not most, that's not fair. I live in a world now where a lot of my peers have questioned my presence because of the gun I held at 16. And a lot of those same peers will make these sort of righteous arguments about divestment, but won't make the same kind of righteous arguments about how institutions should be treating people. And so I think that, I don't know, man, I think that if I was running a clinic at a law school and we were developing projects and somebody suggested that, I would say, you do understand that 1% of the people in this country going up for parole have lawyers. How about working on that?
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's funny that you mentioned that your second job while in prison was with the library. And so Ty Hallmack said that I'm a master's student at UMD in the Library and Information Sciences program. Can you talk about what role libraries and librarians can play in helping incarcerated people access information?
That people gonna think I asked Ty to ask that question, because this gives me the perfect prompting to talk about my new project. Um, I think it was in August. I got a grant from the Mellon Foundation for $5.25 million, which is crazy even saying that out loud. Uh, I hope my folks ain't watching this. They didn't give me that money though. So if you about to ask me for money, you should know that I got the grant, but Yale holds the purse strings. But anyway, the project is called the Million Book Project. And what we're doing is curating a 500 book freedom collection. Because the idea is, I live with books. My son has a bookshelf. Both of my sons have bookshelves. Me and my wife share a bookshelf, but then we got another bookshelf downstairs. I got a closet with like 1,000 books in it. And I got books all on the floor, all around me. I did 8.5 years in prison, and it was never a bookshelf that was near, 500 feet of where I slept. And so my notion is to put these bookshelves in people's housing units, put them in solitary confinement units, put them in segregation units, put them in medical units, and also put one where the correctional officers are. Because what I understand is a lot of COs live in the same kind of neighborhoods that I grew up in. You go to a prison in Virginia, and don't nobody want to be a CO. Ain't nobody like my life's dream is to be a correctional officer. And so I think it's a way in which we hold folks in disdain as if they're making choices. So some of them might be making choices out of spite, or some of them might be spiteful, just that's their nature. But folks are trying to get by the best they can. And so you ask what role librarians can play. I've been working closely with librarians to one, to curate this collection, but two, to facilitate these books being in the hands of people in prison. Right now, I made a freedom edition of my book Felon because a lot of prisons you can't get hardback books in. And so my first question was, how can I write a book and say it really matters to people? It's crazy. I got so many books that I can't find my book, and I'm on a small desk. But it's like, so my book is hardback, and but you can't get hardbacks in a lot of prisons. And so how do I write a book and I dedicate it to dudes doing time? By the way, 3 of those dudes are out right now. But when I published this, they were still in and they out by my hand, which I'm really proud of. But how can I dedicate a book to dudes and they can't get it because they locked up? Felt like greasy to me, And so I raised some money and I produced a paperback edition that we send for free to people in prison. So far, we sent like 2,000 in. And then again, we send in a million other books that's not written by me. And the point is, librarians are the conduit for those books getting into the hands of readers. Right now I'm working closely with librarians in Texas, North Dakota, California, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, to get books in the hands of people. And ultimately, by the time the Million Book Project is over, we would have been placed some number of these freedom collections in prisons in every state in the country and Puerto Rico. But but the point is that librarians are vital. I remember when I was in prison, a librarian is the person that gave me the address to all of these writers that I wanted to write. I was so naive though. I would write them letters. And being a professor is like an itinerant profession. It's like being a barnstorm or something, right? And I didn't know that, right? And I didn't even know to read the publication date, the copyright date. So I read every book as if it was written last year. And I will write folks at those universities that the book said that they were teaching and not know that they hadn't been there in a decade. So nobody wrote me back, but like one person. I know all these people now. I'd be like, yo, you ain't write me? They'd be like, I didn't get your letter. What you mean? So it's funny, but it was the librarian who gave me those email addresses. So I think the librarians play a vital role. And in fact, Elizabeth Alexander, who's now the president of Mellon, and Mellon is the foundation that gave me that money. I remember in Virginia, I was able to get one of her books because the public library had I can't believe I can't think of the word of it. Not intramural, but I can't think of the word right now, but they had one of those programs where they had a like a contract, they had an agreement where I could interlibrary loan program. So the public library had an interlibrary loan program with the prison. I mean, that's something right now that that people who are librarians can say, wait a minute, what relationship do we have to the prison? Particularly when a book like mine, most poetry books got a print run of 1,000, 2,000. That's never going to make it into a prison library. So an interlibrary loan is particularly important when you want to get that kind of material in the prisons.
Thank you. And so we know that you have authored a few books and that books have played a significant part in your time in prison. You read a lot. And so Jeffrey Sauer said, hi, Mr. Betts. Thank you so much for your strength and stories. Are there any authors or writing that you hold very close that you think people should know more about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. But I would say if I had to name a few folks, one, so I'm going to say a writer who's passed that was really important to me too. First, I would say Etheridge Knight. It was one of the first poets and the first poet that I read who did time in prison. And, being in a solitary cell, somebody slid this book to me, The Black Poets. And I was in solitary confinement. And this book just profoundly changed my life, introduced me to the work of Etheridge Knight, the work of Lucille Clifton, and the work of so many folks who are touchstones now. So I would say Etheridge Knight. I would say Lucille Clifton. She has a line in one poem called Come Celebrate With Me. Every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. I remember one Mother's Day, I sent that to every woman I knew. I feel like her work has just been a touchstone for understanding how you could be wise and complicated and nuanced without trying to speak above people's level of understanding. So much of poetry sometimes feels like pyrotechnics, whereas like Lucille Clifton was kind of like Bill Withers. She was just, you hear it and you get it immediately, and it wasn't trying to be fancy. And then the last person I would say is a contemporary writer who has a few books out. but he recently, so Heavy, his name is Keith Lamone, Heavy, and then he recently published this, he republished this, it's called How to Slowly Kill Yourself in America. And I remember reading the title essay in 2012. I was teaching in 3 different community colleges, and in one of them, I was the only Black person in the classroom, and we were teaching how to slowly kill yourself, and it was great watching these students like respond to my presence in the classroom, but then respond to the work that I was bringing in that ranged from like documentaries like Waiting on Superman to James Baldwin to Keys. And so I think that's a contemporary writer that I would definitely say that you should read. And his memoir, Heavy, is like one of the best memoirs I've read in the past decade. So I would say I would flag those 3 folks.
Great. So what advice would you give to our students who want to reform the criminal justice system? What would you tell them to inspire them to help out to reform the criminal justice system?
Well, one, I mean, I would say proximity is important. You know, a lot of times we talk about reforming a system that we aren't proximate to. And we choose what we want to be proximate to. And I say proximity is important, but it's important not to be singular in what you choose to be proximate to. I have to tell 2 quick stories. When A Question of Freedom came out, I was asked a little while later to appear on this panel in DC, Ernest Gaines, A Lesson Before Dying. I'm on a panel, and they had a DOC person from the Juvenile Detention Center there. And this was in 2010, one of the most violent, you know, drive-by shootings that occurred. 5 people got killed, little girl, little boy, some other folks. And I'm on this panel, and it's a father in the audience, and it's a mother in the audience, and the father is like agitated. And I don't understand, you know, why he's so upset. And he talking, you know, cash junk to me, right? And everybody there, he's talking about how I wouldn't have survived the DC jail, and he's just mad, and I don't understand why. And he's like, you know, they killed my son the other day, and I know it was somebody who had been locked up in juvie, and he should have stayed locked up. But because y'all on this Missouri model and y'all want to coddle folks, my son is dead, right? And I said something, because, you know, me, I just laugh at stuff sometimes. And I wasn't laughing at him, but I was trying to break the tension, you know? And so I said something, and folks laughed. And I was like, we just here to talk about a book, bro. I ain't with the DOC, you know? And I laughed, and man, he got upset. And the woman in the back, she ran up on us with her hand in her purse. And that had me shook a little bit because, you know, I ain't know what to think. She get to the front. She pull out her pictures, her daughter, neck damn near chopped off by the AK-47. And she like, you think something funny? And she, you know, blaming us. And my boy was so young that he was still in diapers. And I just wanted to go home, you know. Fast forward, just last year, I'm hiring prosecutors. And this Black woman says, attorney such and such, the commissioners, thank you for letting me speak. And she said, attorney this, attorney that, attorney that, attorney Betts, I want y'all to know, all of y'all, that y'all responsible for the death of Black and brown boys and men in the state of Connecticut. She wouldn't give it the mic. She just talk, wouldn't give up the mic. And I'm sitting there, while I'm sitting there, I'm getting phone calls from people in prison that I ain't answering because I'm on this panel serving my public duty. Most folks choose what they want to be proximate with. You know, they go to the meeting, the protest, the hiring of a prosecutor, or they go to the meeting, the protest because they mad that their child got murdered. But this is a group of Black folks that want something completely different. You know, the man and the woman wanted that boy to stay locked up so that their folks would be safe. And this other woman wants the prosecutor police, so that folks would be safe. But they want different things, diametrically opposed things, you know? And so when I say be proximate, I say, don't be proximate to a singular thing and then be all zealously righteous as you choose the camp that you agree with to always dance with. I would say be proximate, but be proximate to all of it. And if you feel, if your stomach ain't turning at the end of a day's work, you ain't doing no work. You know, because when I call into a prison, somebody called me from a prison and we talking about getting them out and they done killed somebody. And the family member of the person that they done killed saying they should die in prison. Like, I know it ain't easy. And I know that a lot of the folks who do the advocacy work avoid all of that messiness, because, it's far easier to live by slogans than to live by tears.
Thank you.
Thank you for that story. And I think we do all have work to do, right, in some way. And so we do have a comment / question from David Tilley. I'm a 50-year-old white male professor here at UMD. I'm always inspired by the tenacity of young men that have been through adversity. Also, I'm always searching for ways that I can use my position to improve my empathy and the empathy of my students for people that have been disadvantaged because of their race. What words of wisdom can you share that would give me some guidance on where I can spend my time to improve cultural empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things for real. I think that we just need to read more widely and more diversely. I think one of the things that I find most humbling is when I come into a room and the writers that I love that made me are completely unknown to everybody. I find that really humbling because it makes me think, how can you know me and love me and want to like see me be anything in this world when you haven't done any of the work that would make you have a foundation for that empathy. So that's the first thing. And then, I mean, honestly, my success, I told the story about me going to University of Maryland, but my whole story is littered with occasions. I mean, Bruh Yao, who was one of the owners of Caribou Books. I met him, I met him at Bowie, and he was like, man, where you go to college? I was like, I don't go to college. He's like, oh, where you graduate from? I was like, man, look, I just got out of prison. And I could talk to him like that because he looked super young. And this was 2005. This was right around the time I went to Maryland. And his next question after I said that was, oh, you sound like a writer. Are you a poet? Now, I did not sound like a writer at all. You know what I mean? But that was him being empathetic. And I don't know how many people, and then he followed it up, because I had tried to get a job at Caribou, but I didn't follow up. He was like, man, you should come by the store, man, think about applying for a job. And I was like, fool, who is you? You can't make no decisions. And then my aunt was like, did you talk to the owner of the bookstore? I was like, nah, I just talked to some young cat that worked for him. She was like, that was the owner. I was like, oh, damn. I just told this fool I got out of prison. I know he ain't gonna call me, and he followed up with an email. So I think it's two things. I think one, what is it in your backstory and your reading and your life that makes you empathetic? Two, when you make that move, that empathetic move, which is what Yao did when he said, are you a writer? As opposed to fixating on a thing that I couldn't let go. I still can't let go of prison. But he was like, I'm not going to fixate on that. Let me pivot this to something that I care about. And then three, he followed up because that would have been enough. Really, the conversation that he and I had was enough. It was sustaining. It was fulfilling. But then three, he followed up. And my life is filled with people who have done that. They've done the first thing, they've done the second thing, and they've done the third thing. And I think the third thing is how you move people from where they are to where they want to be, not where you necessarily want them to be. So I would say that all of us had an opportunity to do those three things, and it ain't got to be something that's regular. But if you can't name a person you've done that for, and you've had a long career at a university and you've only done it for success stories, because when I got admitted to Maryland, a lot of people don't make it. I mean, a lot of people go and they get the. I'm mad because they changed the name of the scholarship to the Frederick Douglass Scholarship, and so I keep telling people I had to tase, and they like, you had a taser, like. So now I'm telling people, oh, I had a Frederick Douglass scholarship. I'm just backdating it, right? But like a lot of people get those scholarships and they aren't necessarily successful. And what, especially people coming out of prison. The university said, we making a bet on you. And I think the question is, how many people are we willing to make a bet on? And not being disappointed if they fail, just recognizing that making a bet on people is one of the things we do to sustain humanity.
We are coming up to the top of the hour, so we may have time for one or two more questions. But a while ago, you had showed the paperback book of Felons. And so I was curious as to the visual work for the cover of the book, maybe having you talk more about that. And then I popped into the Q&A, and William Cohen mentioned that there's a huge, amazing painting inspired by your poem Gazelle that hangs in the English department. Can you talk about how you've collaborated with other artists?
Yeah, and I want to answer one other question that I saw about public speaking. When I got out of prison, the first time I did a poetry reading, I was definitely terrified. My heart was beating out of my chest. I was mumbling and I was horrible. Then, when I gave the speech at the University of Maryland and I thought I was good at that point, they were like, nah, brother, you talking way too fast. And you used to talking to one person or 10 people or however many people go to those cafes where you be reading those poems and things. But this is like thousands. So you need to slow down. And so I would say that I may be a skilled communicator, but I work at it. And I would say that any young person, any college student who wants to work at being a communicator just has to practice. It's literally something that you could get better at over time and with practice. So I would just say that, and there's all kinds of books out there about it, and it's just simply a product of practice. In terms of the artwork, Titus Gafari, I mean, you can see it on my wall. I did these prints. You can't see them well because I got a cheap camera, but if you look up the redaction project, you can see a series of prints I did with my man Titus, and he's the person who did the cover art for this for Felon, and the cover art comes from a series that he did called the Jerome Project, and it is the portraits of a lot of men with the same name, excuse me, who had mugshots. He dipped the portraits in black tar to signify the way in which prison seeks to erase who you are. And this was so me using his artwork was just because he's a good friend of mine, and he's a good friend of mine, and the work captured what I wanted to say, what prison tries to do. That piece at Maryland, it was a partnership that was different because that was just I gave him the poem and the artist rendered the poem with the words in the way that he saw fit. With me and Titus, I got these pieces, these redacted poems that I made because I turned these court cases, 70-page documents. I turned them into poems, and so like this is one of them where you could actually see the redaction lines, and the reason why I did that is because the it's hard to understand, truly it's actually hard to understand um legalese. And I had these cases where the Civil Rights Corps, an organization in DC led by Alec Kirkistanis, they were suing localities for money bail, which was fascinating to me. Like you could sue a state because they're locking you up because you can't pay bail, because they lock you up because you can't pay your traffic tickets. Like this is a constitutional violation. This is like to say that I could take this to court and make the court address this issue. But what does it mean if you could write this document and the very people that you're representing can't understand what's there? Numerosity. What jurisdiction? Like, don't nobody understand what that stuff mean. You know what I mean? And I'm a lawyer. I don't even want to. I've used the word numerosity 4 times in my life, and each time I felt like I got like deeply sickened a little bit. It's like getting a tetanus shot. And so I wanted to take those documents and turn it into something that my mama could understand. And I did it by redacting it and redacting it and redacting it to the only thing that was left was like the truth and beauty of what the folks were saying about their experience and about the need for justice. And I did that. And then me and Titus were talking about working together. He's like, oh yeah, what if I did this? And he did etchings of people who were involved in this case. And we double dropped the etchings because like the mugshot is a way to say, this is what I think about you just by seeing you. You see a mugshot, you're like, ooh, okay, that person fell on hard times, but we wanted to turn that mugshot image to a thing of beauty. And then also we wanted to put 2 images up there so that it wasn't, you had to look closely to see the person, and then we put and then we silk screen the, the, um, the poem on there to create prints. And we created, really, I guess we created 50 of them and we showed it at MoMA at the Museum of Modern Art, which was really amazing for me because I'm a poet, be having to work at the Museum of Modern Art. But it's amazing for me to be able to like embark. And that was a true partnership because that was me and him, 2 Black fathers from similar childhoods, you know, living in New Haven, knowing each other and knowing each other's friends. Our kids know each other, we hang out. And so that was like a true partnership and it was a collaboration and it grew into this thing that we didn't expect. So I would say that that is emblematic, I think, of how I conceive and conceptualize partnerships. Um, yeah.
Great. And so we do have time for one more question, and we'll take that from President Pines.
So, considering your time incarcerated, what was the most important thing you learned while you were incarcerated?
This is going to sound like a silly answer, right? But you got to understand that when I was in second grade, I tested into the talented and gifted program. And then for my entire childhood, they'd be pulling me out of classes. I grew up in Suitland on Swan Road. I should have went to Andrew Jackson Middle School. They sent me to Walker Mill Middle School because my mom put me in a magnet school. Walker Mill's in Capitol Heights, same neighborhood that I grew up in, similar kind of neighborhood, but I was now sequestered from the kids from the neighborhood, and they called them, what do they call them, like general population or some stupid like that, and and I always thought that because I was the one that got shipped out of my neighborhood and bused into this other school, that I was somehow better than like so many people I grew up with. And I imagine I would go to college, even though, nobody in my family had been to college. I was still first generation college student, despite 9 years of prison, first generation graduate student. And the thing is, like, I thought that I was better than the dudes that like I was doing dirt with, that I was playing ball with, that I was getting high with. And and it is disastrous to try to make it through this world, constantly holding on to this notion that you're better than the person standing beside you. And going to prison at 16, the first thing I recognized is that like I went to prison before everybody that I knew basically. And I recognized that I was like no better than any of the men around me. And that was probably the single most important thing I learned because I couldn't fight. I mean, I ain't want to fight since like second grade. So I wasn't gonna go to prison and tough my way through it. And yeah, I became an educator, man. I became like a GED tutor. I became a law clerk. I became like a pod librarian. I wrote people's legal cases for them. And it taught me how to be in a world without having to like demean others. And that was the and I don't know if I would have learned that lesson without prison. Not that I'm thankful or grateful for prison, but I am grateful for the transformation that happened there, not being one um, that could aptly be described as a disaster. So I think that was the most important thing that I learned.
So
Although,
can
go
I
ahead,
say
President Pines.
that to you? So one last comment. Would you like to leave the community at University of Maryland with any final thoughts? And then I want to say one more thing, not Tifa, after I give Mr. Betts a chance to say that.
Yeah, I will say this. You know, man, I swore that I was finished with school when I was at Maryland. I had a full tuition scholarship to graduate school in Maryland, and I got my MFA at the same time. It basically overlapped with my undergrad degree, and so I didn't. My GPA didn't matter at all. I mean, I could have been like what? Shakespeare? I'm not doing it. I'll take a C. All I need is a C to keep my scholarship. I'm good. And then the final semester, I ain't need nothing. I just needed to graduate. So I didn't even need to have any GPA. I could have just been like, I'm out of here. I'm going to get a couple D's. I'm gonna get some C's, but I'm not going to be showing up at this class because I got this baby. I got to change these diapers. I'm done with school. I said I was finished. I'm done. But I felt like I was obligated to do well. And what's crazy is that, that mattered because I thought school was over. And then years later, I'm like, yo, I'm gonna go to law school. Now, had I gotten one C or one more B, I don't get into Yale Law School. And so the thing I'll leave you with is that right now you're sitting here, you might have no sense of where you want to be 5 years from now. You don't want to make decisions today that close doors that you might want to walk through 5 years from now. And I think that's like the most important lesson. And I didn't learn a lesson. I just felt like I owed the university my effort. I didn't do it because I imagined it was something waiting for me 5 years down the road. But I know for a fact I would not have gotten into Yale Law School had I simply gotten one more B. And that's frightening because it was quite easy for me to be like, I mean, one day my kid pushed a button on my computer and it flipped the screen upside down. And he was like 8 months, and I could have just been like, this is a wrap. I'm not writing this paper. I spent like 3 hours trying to figure out how to move the cursor in the opposite direction to flip it back over and then wrote my paper. And it was just like small moments like that where I could have been like, you know what? I'm gonna go to sleep, man. And so I would suggest that, you just remember that you got obligation to put forth your best effort so that you don't betray your future self.
That is great advice to leave our students with. I just want to thank you for sharing your very inspirational story, and more importantly, being your true, authentic self with all of us today. The adversity that you have gone through and the excellence and passion that you have shown in your work shows that anybody, including Mr. Reginald Betts, Dwayne Betts, can do things that impact society positively from the adversity that he faced. And I, as the president of the University of Maryland, I just want to say I'm very proud of you. I'm glad we were the school that believed in you. And I'm just proud you're a Terp. And I thank you for coming and speaking to our audience and our entire community today. And we're proud of you, Mr. Betts. Keep up the great work in your role in Connecticut. Thank you.
Much obliged, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Duane, it was truly a pleasure to have you here today. And I agree with President Pines that discussion was timely and it was relevant, and we enjoyed having just like a really real honest conversation. I do hope that we continue to have these conversations on campus and in our own personal lives. To everyone who attended, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone stay safe, be well, and have a great evening.
Thank you.